Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The flames danced against the midnight sky like demons celebrating their victory, while Etienne Beaumont watched 20 years of his life turn to ash and ember in the Colorado wilderness. His barn, the one he had built with his own hands from timber he had cut and stones he had carried, was being devoured by fire that had been set by men whose faces he could still see in the dancing shadows. The acrid smoke burned his throat as he stood helpless, his Colt .45 empty and useless in his trembling hand, while the gang that had promised this destruction rode away into the darkness with laughter that echoed off the mountain walls like the sound of breaking glass. Just 3 days earlier, he had been the richest man in Cedar Ridge, with gold dust worth more than most men earned in 5 years hidden in leather pouches beneath his cabin floorboards. The strike in the mountains above his ranch had been the kind of discovery that frontier legends were built on. A vein of pure gold that had taken him 2 years of backbreaking work to extract, but which had yielded enough wealth to buy a spread 10 times the size of his current holdings. His plans had been simple and practical. Sell the gold in Denver, purchase the Morrison Ranch that adjoined his property, and build the kind of cattle operation that could support a family and provide security for the rest of his life. But then he had seen Celeste Moreau crying beside her husband's grave in the town cemetery, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, and something in her grief had awakened emotions he had kept buried since his own tragic losses had taught him that caring too much was a luxury that frontier life rarely allowed. The young widow's tears had been falling like rain onto the freshly turned earth that covered the man who had promised her a future in the American West, only to die of consumption before their first anniversary, leaving her alone and destitute in a territory where single women were viewed as either burdens or opportunities by men whose concept of marriage was more about convenience than love. Etienne's decision to trade his entire fortune for the chance to ease her suffering had been made in the space of a heartbeat, as he watched her count the few coins in her purse and realized they weren't enough to pay for her husband's funeral or secure passage back to Louisiana, where family might provide the support that frontier charity couldn't offer. His approach had been respectful and careful, his offer delivered with the kind of gentle courtesy that his French mother had taught him to show to women in distress, but which few men in Cedar Ridge bothered to practice when dealing with females whose circumstances made them vulnerable to exploitation. The widow's reaction to his unexpected generosity had been a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and desperate hope that made her tears flow even harder as she struggled to understand why a stranger would sacrifice his own future to rescue someone he barely knew from circumstances that weren't his responsibility to fix. When he had pressed the leather pouch containing every ounce of his gold into her hands and told her it was enough to pay for the funeral, buy passage home, and support herself until she could rebuild her life, her whispered, "Why?" had carried the weight of someone who had learned that kindness usually came with prices that made it more dangerous than cruelty. And now, as he watched his barn burn while remembering the way her tears had stopped falling when she realized his gift was genuine, Etienne understood that his act of compassion had somehow triggered a chain of events that would test whether love and sacrifice could survive in a world where violence was the only language that some men understood. Celeste Moreau had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 months earlier as the mail-order bride of Henri Dubois, a French-Canadian trapper who had saved enough money to purchase a small homestead and advertise for a wife who could share the challenges and rewards of building a life in the Colorado Territory. Her journey from the sophisticated society of New Orleans to the primitive conditions of frontier life had been motivated by desperation rather than adventure, as the death of her father had left her with debts that could only be resolved through marriage to someone whose circumstances were humble, but whose character seemed honest based on carefully written letters that had crossed half a continent to find her. Henri had been everything his correspondence had promised. Gentle, hard-working, and genuinely devoted to the young woman whose willingness to risk everything for the chance of happiness had impressed him with its courage. Their brief marriage had been built on mutual respect and growing affection that had been developing into genuine love when the consumption that had been hiding in his lungs finally revealed itself through coughing fits that brought up blood and fever that wouldn't break, despite every remedy that frontier medicine could provide. The 6 weeks between Henri's diagnosis and his death had been a nightmare of watching someone she had grown to care about waste away while being powerless to prevent the inevitable outcome that left her alone in a place where her survival depended on charity from neighbors who had their own struggles to manage. The funeral expenses had consumed most of their modest savings, while the discovery that Henri's medical bills were larger than expected had left her facing the choice between keeping the homestead and having enough money to return to Louisiana, where family connections might provide employment as a seamstress or governess. The morning when Etienne had found her crying in the cemetery, she had been trying to decide whether to sell Henri's possessions to raise money for his funeral or use what little cash remained to buy passage on the next stage heading east toward civilization and family support that might offer alternatives to the kind of marriage proposals she had been receiving from men whose interest in her person was more practical than romantic. The widow's options in frontier communities were typically limited to remarriage, employment in saloons that offered services beyond serving drinks, or attempting to maintain farms that required physical strength and agricultural knowledge that most women lacked. Etienne's gift had changed everything by providing enough financial security to make choices based on preference rather than desperation. But it had also created obligations that she felt but couldn't define, as accepting such extraordinary generosity from a stranger required some form of acknowledgement that went beyond simple gratitude. Her decision to remain in Cedar Ridge rather than returning to Louisiana had been influenced by recognition that his sacrifice deserved better than being treated as a convenient solution to her problems that required no further consideration once her immediate crisis had been resolved. When she had asked the shopkeeper about the cowboy who had given her his fortune, the stories she heard had revealed a man whose own losses had taught him to value compassion over wealth, but whose generosity had apparently made him enemies among people whose plans had been disrupted by his unexpected decision to help someone whose welfare was none of his concern. The gold that Etienne had traded for Celeste's tears represented more than just money. It was the product of 2 years of solitary labor in the mountains above Cedar Ridge, where he had discovered a vein of precious metal that could have made him one of the wealthiest men in the Colorado Territory if he had chosen personal prosperity over human compassion. His knowledge of mining had been gained through necessity rather than formal education, as the death of his parents in a cholera epidemic had left him responsible for supporting his younger sister Marie through work that required him to learn quickly or starve slowly in a territory where survival depended on practical skills rather than family connections or inherited wealth. The cabin where he lived alone had originally been built for 2, with space for the family he had planned to raise with Marie Claire Fontaine, the daughter of a prosperous merchant whose approval Etienne had been earning through steady work and careful saving until smallpox had claimed her life, along with most of Cedar Ridge's children during the epidemic that had swept through the settlement like wildfire through dry grass. The loss of his fiancée had been complicated by the realization that her death had also eliminated his motivation for accumulating wealth, leaving him with skills and property, but no clear purpose for using them to build the kind of future that had made sense when shared with someone whose dreams had matched his own. His decision to continue mining despite his personal losses had been motivated more by habit than ambition, as the physical demands of extracting gold from unforgiving rock provided distraction from grief that threatened to overwhelm him during the long winter evenings when memories of what might have been made solitude feel more like punishment than peace. The strike that had made him wealthy had been discovered by accident, as a cave-in had revealed a vein of pure gold that had been hidden behind layers of ordinary stone, creating wealth that felt more like cruel irony than divine blessing for someone whose greatest treasure had been buried in the town cemetery. The 2 years he had spent methodically extracting every ounce of gold from his secret mine had provided time for reflection about what wealth meant when there was no one to share it with, and what success represented when measured against losses that couldn't be calculated in terms of money or property. His growing understanding that possessions were meaningless without people who made them valuable had prepared him for the moment when he would encounter someone whose need was greater than his own attachment to security that had always been more theoretical than practical. The evening before he found Celeste crying beside her husband's grave, Etienne had been sitting in his empty cabin, counting gold that represented more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, while wondering what purpose such wealth was supposed to serve for someone whose dreams had died along with the people who had made them meaningful. His decision to give away his fortune had been building for months through recognition that accumulating more wealth couldn't restore what he had lost, while helping someone else might provide the kind of meaning that personal prosperity had failed to deliver during the loneliest period of his life. The Garrison gang had been planning to rob Etienne's cabin for 3 months. Ever since word had spread through the criminal network that operated in the mountain territories that a French cowboy had struck gold and was keeping his wealth in hiding places that could be looted by men with sufficient courage and firepower to overwhelm a single defender. Jake Garrison's reputation as the most ruthless outlaw in the Colorado Territory had been built through a series of successful raids that had left victims dead and witnesses too terrified to provide testimony that could lead to arrests, while his gang's knowledge of remote areas and escape routes had made them nearly impossible for territorial law enforcement to track effectively. The intelligence about Etienne's gold had come from Tommy Morrison, a drifter who had worked briefly on neighboring ranches and had observed the Frenchman's secretive behavior and obvious prosperity despite having no visible source of income beyond subsistence farming that couldn't account for his ability to purchase supplies and equipment that suggested hidden wealth. Morrison's casual inquiries around town had revealed enough details about mining activities in the mountains to convince him that Etienne had discovered something valuable enough to justify the risk of robbing someone whose isolation made him an ideal target for criminals who preferred victims who couldn't call for help. The gang's original plan had been simple and brutal: surround the cabin at night, torture Etienne until he revealed the location of his gold, kill him to eliminate witnesses, and disappear into the wilderness before anyone discovered what had happened. Their reconnaissance had revealed that he lived alone, rarely received visitors, and was far enough from town that gunshots wouldn't attract attention from neighbors who might complicate their robbery with unwanted interference from local law enforcement or armed citizens. But Etienne's unexpected decision to give away his fortune had been discovered by the gang just hours before their planned attack, when Morrison had returned to town for supplies and learned from saloon gossip that the French cowboy had somehow given all his money to the Moreau widow to pay for her husband's funeral and provide her with passage back to Louisiana. The news that their intended victim had voluntarily disposed of the wealth they had planned to steal had enraged Garrison beyond rational thought, as months of planning and the considerable expenses of organizing a major robbery had been wasted by what he viewed as an act of incredible stupidity. The decision to burn Etienne's barn had been motivated by revenge rather than profit. As Garrison's twisted sense of justice demanded punishment for someone whose generosity had cost the gang a fortune while making them look foolish to other criminals who had been expecting them to return with enough gold to finance additional operations throughout the territory. The fire was intended as a warning that acts of unexpected kindness wouldn't be tolerated by men whose livelihood depended on predictable human selfishness, while also serving as an example to other potential victims that cooperation with gang demands was preferable to the alternative of having their property destroyed and their lives threatened by people whose patience with interference was extremely limited. The dawn that followed the barn fire revealed destruction that was both complete and symbolic, as the building that had represented Etienne's dreams of prosperity and family had been reduced to a blackened skeleton of charred timber and twisted metal that stood against the morning sky like a monument to the price of compassion in a territory where kindness was often viewed as weakness by men whose survival depended on exploiting rather than helping their neighbors. The smell of smoke and ash hung in the air like incense at a funeral, while the scattered remains of tools, equipment, and feed created a landscape of loss that made clear the gang's intention to destroy rather than simply steal. Etienne's survey of the damage revealed losses that went beyond simple monetary calculation, as the barn had contained not just the practical necessities for running a ranch, but also personal items that had connected him to his past and his hopes for the future. The hand tools that his father had brought from France, the saddle that had been a gift from Marie Claire before her death, and the carefully saved supplies for expanding his operation had all been consumed by flames that had been set by men whose anger about his generosity had motivated destruction that served no purpose except expressing their rage at being cheated of expected profits. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his grim inventory of destruction as riders crested the hill that overlooked his property with the purposeful movement that suggested official business rather than casual visiting. Sheriff Tom Bradley's arrival with 2 deputies was both expected and dreaded, as law enforcement's investigation of the fire would require explanations about why someone had targeted his property for destruction, which would inevitably lead to questions about his recent financial transactions and his relationship with the widow whose welfare had motivated his sacrifice. Bradley's reputation as an honest lawman was matched by his practical understanding that justice in frontier territories often required compromises between legal idealism and political reality, as his limited resources and the vast distances involved in territorial law enforcement made it impossible to investigate every crime or protect every potential victim from criminal retaliation. His questions about enemies, recent conflicts, and possible motives for the attack were delivered with the kind of professional thoroughness that suggested he took the crime seriously, while also indicating his awareness that solving it would require more luck than skill. The conversation that followed revealed the complex relationship between individual acts of kindness and community safety, as Etienne's decision to help the widow had apparently triggered consequences that could affect other residents who might become targets for gang retaliation or criminal activity that viewed the entire community as hostile to their interests. When Bradley asked directly whether his generosity toward Celeste Moreau might have motivated the attack, Etienne faced the first of many moments when he would have to choose between protecting someone he cared about and accepting responsibility for consequences that he had never intended to create, but which his actions had nevertheless set in motion. The news of the barn fire reached Celeste before noon, carried by Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, whose network of community gossip ensured that significant events were distributed throughout Cedar Ridge faster than official news services could have managed, even if such services had existed in their remote corner of the Colorado Territory. The details were sparse but devastating. Etienne's barn had been burned to the ground during the night along with everything it contained, by unknown attackers who had disappeared into the wilderness before anyone could respond to the distant glow that had been visible from town for those few residents who had been awake to notice it. Celeste's reaction to the news was immediate and overwhelming, as guilt crashed over her like a mountain avalanche that buried rational thought beneath the crushing weight of understanding that her troubles had somehow brought disaster to the man whose kindness had saved her from destitution. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. 3 days after Etienne had given her his fortune, someone had attacked his property with the kind of deliberate malice that suggested personal revenge rather than random criminal activity that might have targeted any isolated ranch in the area. Her first instinct was to rush to his property to see the damage firsthand and offer whatever assistance someone in her circumstances could provide. But social conventions and practical considerations made such direct action complicated for a widow whose reputation required careful protection in a community where women's behavior was scrutinized for any sign of impropriety that might justify the kind of male attention that could destroy what little security she had managed to achieve through Etienne's generosity. The internal debate that consumed her morning centered on the question of responsibility and obligation. Did accepting his gift create moral debts that required her to share in the consequences of his sacrifice? Or would attempting to help him only make his situation worse by confirming whatever connection the attackers had assumed existed between them? Her limited understanding of criminal psychology provided no clear guidance about whether distancing herself from Etienne would protect him from further retaliation, or whether abandoning him would simply encourage additional attacks by demonstrating that his act of kindness had earned him no loyalty or support from the person he had helped. The decision that finally ended her internal struggle came when she realized that guilt about consequences she hadn't intended was less important than gratitude for benefits she had definitely received, and that moral courage sometimes required accepting risks rather than avoiding them when someone who had sacrificed for your welfare needed support in return. When she told Mrs. Patterson that she intended to visit Etienne's ranch to assess the damage and offer assistance, the older woman's shocked expression and immediate warnings about reputation and propriety made clear that her decision would be viewed as scandalous by people whose concepts of proper behavior didn't include provisions for extraordinary circumstances that required extraordinary responses. Celeste's journey to Etienne's ranch was undertaken in defiance of every social convention that governed women's behavior in frontier communities. But her determination to offer support to someone whose generosity had changed her life proved stronger than her concern about community gossip or the practical dangers of traveling alone through territory where recent criminal activity had demonstrated that isolated individuals were vulnerable to attack by people whose respect for law and social order was limited to whatever could be enforced through immediate retaliation. The scene that greeted her arrival was even more devastating than Mrs. Patterson's description had suggested, as the charred remains of the barn created a monument to destruction that spoke of hatred rather than simple robbery, while the scattered debris and obvious signs of deliberate arson made clear that whoever had attacked Etienne's property had been motivated by personal animosity rather than financial desperation. The contrast between the peaceful beauty of the mountain valley and the ugly evidence of human malice created an emotional impact that brought tears to her eyes as she began to understand the full cost of the kindness that had rescued her from desperation. Etienne's reaction to her unexpected arrival was a mixture of surprise, pleasure, and concern that reflected his awareness that her presence at his ranch would inevitably attract attention from neighbors whose gossip could damage her reputation, while also potentially making her a target for whoever had burned his barn. His attempts to convince her to return to town immediately were motivated by protective instincts rather than lack of appreciation for her concern. But his arguments about safety and propriety were undermined by obvious relief that someone cared enough about his welfare to risk social censure and personal danger to offer assistance. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of connection that had developed between them, despite the brief nature of their acquaintance. As shared experiences with loss and their mutual understanding of sacrifice had created emotional bonds that transcended the social barriers that would normally have prevented meaningful interaction between a French cowboy and a Louisiana widow. Their discussion of the fire and its implications moved naturally into broader topics about loneliness, responsibility, and the ways that acts of kindness could create both benefits and obligations that changed the lives of everyone involved. It was during this conversation that Celeste first understood the full scope of what Etienne had sacrificed for her welfare, as his description of the gold mine and the wealth he had accumulated revealed that his gift had represented not just financial security, but years of dangerous work and careful planning that had been intended to create the foundation for a future that his generosity had now made impossible. When she realized that his act of compassion had cost him everything he had worked to achieve, her gratitude was complicated by recognition that accepting such a sacrifice created moral obligations that simple appreciation couldn't fulfill, and that somehow she needed to find ways to ensure that his kindness wouldn't ultimately destroy the man who had shown it. The practical work of cleaning up fire damage provided opportunities for Celeste and Etienne to spend time together that would have been impossible under normal social circumstances, as the immediate necessity of assessing losses and planning reconstruction created legitimate reasons for extended collaboration that community gossip couldn't easily criticize. Their shared labor revealed compatibility that went beyond simple mutual attraction into territory involving genuine partnership and complementary skills that made their combined efforts more effective than either could have achieved alone. Celeste's organizational abilities and attention to detail proved invaluable for cataloging losses and prioritizing reconstruction efforts, while her knowledge of household management and practical economics provided perspectives that helped Etienne understand which aspects of rebuilding were essential and which could be postponed until resources allowed for less critical improvements. Her suggestions about efficient layouts and multi-purpose design demonstrated intelligence and creativity that impressed someone whose own approach to construction had been based more on tradition than innovation. Etienne's quiet strength and methodical approach to problem-solving created an atmosphere of calm competence that made even overwhelming challenges seem manageable when approached with patience and systematic planning, while his obvious gratitude for her assistance was expressed through consideration and respect that made her feel valued as a partner rather than simply tolerated as someone whose help was accepted out of politeness. Their working relationship developed naturally into something that felt increasingly like genuine friendship, based on mutual appreciation for character traits that their previous experiences had taught them to value highly. The emotional intimacy that grew from shared challenges and mutual support was complicated by awareness that their developing relationship was being observed by community members whose interpretations of their collaboration ranged from benign approval to suspicious speculation about motivations and intentions that might not be as innocent as their public behavior suggested. The careful balance they maintained between appropriate distance and necessary cooperation required constant attention to appearances that could be misinterpreted by people whose understanding of relationships between men and women was limited to categories that didn't include genuine partnerships between equals. It was during one of their evening conversations, as they sat on his cabin porch discussing plans for the new barn while watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, that both began to acknowledge feelings that had been developing despite their efforts to maintain purely practical relationships based on gratitude and mutual assistance. When Etienne admitted that her presence had made him happier than he had been since Marie Claire's death, and Celeste responded that his kindness had given her hope for a future she had thought was impossible, their words carried implications that would require careful consideration about whether their growing attachment could develop into something more permanent without creating additional dangers for both of them. The gossip that had been building around Celeste and Etienne's obvious partnership reached critical mass when Reverend Patterson delivered a Sunday sermon about the dangers of unseemly relationships between men and women whose circumstances made them vulnerable to temptations that could corrupt entire communities if not addressed through appropriate pastoral guidance and community intervention. His carefully worded warnings about the importance of maintaining proper social boundaries were clearly directed at the widow and the cowboy, whose collaboration had become the subject of speculation that ranged from admiring approval to scandalized disapproval. The divided reaction within Cedar Ridge reflected deeper conflicts about social conventions and practical realities that frontier communities struggled to balance when traditional rules clashed with circumstances that required flexibility and adaptation. The women who supported Celeste's right to make her own choices about friendship and assistance were generally those whose own experiences with hardship had taught them to value practical help over social conformity, while those who criticized her behavior were typically more concerned with maintaining community standards that they believed were essential for preventing moral decay in isolated settlements. The men's opinions were equally divided but followed different lines of reasoning, as some admired Etienne's generosity and viewed his relationship with Celeste as natural development from his act of kindness, while others criticized both his financial sacrifice and his apparent romantic interest in a woman whose recent widowhood made such attention premature according to conventional mourning periods. The practical question of whether their relationship strengthened or weakened community stability was debated in the saloon with the kind of passionate intensity that frontier men typically reserved for discussions about politics, land rights, and the proper way to break wild horses. Sheriff Bradley's informal investigation of community sentiment revealed concerns that went beyond simple moral disapproval into territory involving practical worries about whether Etienne's generosity had attracted criminal attention that could threaten other residents, and whether his developing relationship with Celeste might motivate additional attacks by people whose anger about his interference with their plans could lead to broader retaliation against the entire community. His report to the territorial authorities would influence decisions about law enforcement priorities and resource allocation that could determine how much protection Cedar Ridge could expect from federal agents whose responsibilities covered vast areas with limited personnel. The crisis came when Marcus Whelan, the town's wealthiest merchant and most influential citizen, publicly announced his opinion that Celeste should either marry Etienne immediately to legitimize their relationship or leave Cedar Ridge to eliminate the source of controversy that was dividing the community and potentially attracting dangerous attention from criminal elements who might view their prosperity as worth stealing. His ultimatum was delivered with the kind of political authority that carried weight throughout the territory, but it also represented exactly the type of male presumption about women's choices that Celeste had hoped to escape through Etienne's generosity. The garrison gang's surveillance of Cedar Ridge had intensified since the barn burning, as Jake Garrison's obsession with punishing Etienne for ruining their robbery had evolved into a broader campaign of intimidation that included gathering intelligence about potential targets, escape routes, and the community's capacity for organized resistance. Tommy Morrison's reports about the growing relationship between the French cowboy and the Moreau widow had provided additional motivation for revenge. As Garrison viewed their apparent happiness as personal insult that required correction through violence that would demonstrate the consequences of interfering with his plans. The gang's presence in the area had been detected by several ranchers whose experience with criminal activity had taught them to recognize signs that most townspeople would miss. But their warnings to Sheriff Bradley had been discounted as nervous reactions to the barn fire rather than evidence of continuing threats that required immediate action. The limited resources available for territorial law enforcement made comprehensive investigation of suspected criminal activity impossible, while the gang's knowledge of remote hideouts and mountain trails gave them advantages that local authorities couldn't match without federal assistance that was unlikely to arrive quickly enough to prevent additional attacks. Morrison's infiltration of Cedar Ridge's social networks had provided detailed intelligence about daily routines, defensive capabilities, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminals whose success depended on thorough preparation and tactical superiority over victims who were typically unprepared for organized assault. His casual conversations with townspeople had revealed information about work schedules, travel patterns, and relationships that could be used to plan attacks that would maximize damage while minimizing risks to gang members whose survival depended on avoiding direct confrontation with organized opposition. The decision to target Celeste as a means of hurting Etienne had been made after careful consideration of options that included direct assault on his property, attacking his business interests, or eliminating him entirely through assassination that would end his interference permanently. Garrison's calculation that threatening someone Etienne cared about would cause more psychological damage than simply killing him reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the ways that emotional attachments could be exploited by people whose own capacity for caring had been eliminated through years of violence and betrayal. The first attempt to approach Celeste occurred during her weekly trip to town for supplies, when Morrison engineered a seemingly accidental encounter that allowed him to assess her awareness of potential threats, while also testing her reactions to subtle intimidation that could escalate into direct action if circumstances proved favorable. His casual questions about her relationship with Etienne and her plans for the future were delivered with the kind of friendly interest that concealed predatory intent, while his observations of her responses provided intelligence about her psychological state and defensive capabilities that would inform future approaches by gang members whose intentions were far more dangerous than casual conversation. Etienne's recognition that Celeste was being watched came during a morning when his own surveillance of the approaches to his ranch revealed the presence of observers whose concealment techniques and strategic positioning indicated professional criminal experience rather than casual curiosity from neighbors or travelers. The systematic nature of the surveillance suggested planning for future action rather than simple intelligence gathering, while the observer's obvious focus on times when Celeste was present indicated that she had become a specific target for attention that could only have negative implications for her safety. His decision to confront her about the danger was complicated by awareness that warning her about threats could either protect her from harm or create unnecessary fear about situations that might resolve themselves without requiring dramatic changes to their daily routines. The balance between providing adequate information for self-protection and avoiding panic that could disrupt their developing relationship required careful consideration of her character and her likely reactions to news that criminal elements were taking specific interest in her welfare. The conversation that followed his decision to share his concerns revealed Celeste's courage and practical intelligence, as her response to news about being watched was focused on understanding the nature of the threat and developing effective countermeasures rather than simply being frightened into submission or retreat. Her questions about the observer's capabilities, possible motivations, and likely next actions demonstrated analytical thinking that impressed Etienne while also confirming his assessment that she possessed the kind of mental toughness that would be essential for surviving whatever challenges their situation might create. Their discussion of defensive options revealed the limited nature of protection available to frontier residents whose safety depended primarily on their own resources and whatever assistance neighbors could provide during emergencies that might develop faster than official help could arrive. The isolation that had made their relationship possible also created vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit through attacks that would be completed before law enforcement could respond effectively to calls for assistance that might not even be possible if communications were disrupted. The plan they developed for maintaining her safety while continuing their necessary activities required compromises between security and normal life that tested their commitment to each other and their willingness to accept risks that could have been avoided through separation that would eliminate the reasons for criminal interest in their welfare. When Celeste insisted that she wouldn't be driven away from someone whose kindness had saved her life, and Etienne agreed that they would face whatever dangers developed together rather than apart, Their mutual decision marked a turning point in their relationship that transformed casual cooperation into something resembling a true partnership based on shared courage and determination to protect what they had built together. The Garrison Gang's plan to capture Celeste was designed to exploit her weekly routine of visiting the cemetery where her husband was buried. As her predictable schedule and the isolated location of the graveyard created opportunities for abduction that could be executed without witnesses or immediate discovery by people who might organize rescue efforts. Morrison's surveillance had revealed that she typically spent at least an hour at Henry's grave during these visits, often arriving early in the morning when few other people were present and leaving by routes that took her through areas where screams for help wouldn't be heard by potential rescuers. The trap was set with professional precision. As gang members positioned themselves along her usual routes, while Morrison waited near the cemetery with equipment and supplies for restraining and transporting a captive whose cooperation couldn't be assumed and whose resistance might require physical coercion to overcome. The plan's success depended on speed and surprise rather than elaborate deception, as prolonged operations increased the risks of discovery while also providing more opportunities for unexpected complications that could disrupt carefully laid schemes. Celeste's approach to the cemetery followed her normal pattern, but her awareness of being watched had heightened her attention to details that might normally have been ignored as routine features of familiar landscape. The unusual positioning of horses that were too far from the road for casual travelers, the absence of birds in areas where wildlife was typically abundant, and the general sense of wrongness that experienced frontier residents learned to trust as early warning of danger combined to create uneasiness that made her reconsider her usual practices. Her decision to alter her route was based on instincts that had been sharpened by Etienne's warnings, and her own growing understanding that their situation involved threats that required constant vigilance rather than occasional caution. The detour that took her through areas where she could observe the cemetery from concealment revealed the presence of men whose positioning and behavior confirmed that she had been walking into an ambush that would have succeeded if she had continued following predictable patterns. The narrow escape that resulted from her caution was complicated by recognition that avoiding one trap didn't eliminate the underlying danger that had motivated its creation, while the gang's obvious planning and coordination suggested capabilities that would make future attacks more difficult to anticipate or avoid. When she realized that returning home safely required traveling through territory where additional ambushes might be waiting, her situation became a deadly game of survival that would test every skill she had learned during her brief experience with frontier life, while also revealing whether Etienne's fears about her safety had been justified by threats that were even more serious than his warnings had suggested. Etienne's decision to follow Celeste at a distance during her cemetery visit had been motivated by protective instincts that proved to be accurate when his observation of suspicious activity around the graveyard revealed the attempted ambush that she had avoided through alertness and quick thinking. His positioning allowed him to track the gang members as they attempted to intercept her altered route, while his knowledge of local terrain provided opportunities for intervention that could disrupt their plans without requiring direct confrontation that would put both of them at greater risk. The running battle that developed as Etienne used guerrilla tactics to harass the gang while guiding Celeste toward safety demonstrated skills that had been learned during his years of mountain living and mining operations that required constant awareness of natural dangers and human threats. His ability to use landscape features for concealment and tactical advantage while maintaining communication with someone whose survival depended on following his guidance revealed capabilities that went beyond simple frontier self-reliance into territory that suggested military or law enforcement training. Celeste's performance during the crisis proved that her courage was matched by practical intelligence that enabled her to follow complex instructions while maintaining composure under pressure that would have overwhelmed people without her strength of character. Her ability to move quietly through difficult terrain, recognize signals, and respond appropriately to rapidly changing tactical situations demonstrated adaptability that impressed Etienne, while confirming his assessment that she possessed the kind of mental toughness that was essential for survival in circumstances where mistakes could be fatal. The revelation that emerged during their escape was Etienne's admission that his knowledge of combat tactics and wilderness survival had been gained through service as a scout for territorial military forces during campaigns against hostile Indian tribes, and that his early retirement from such dangerous work had been motivated by recognition that constant violence was destroying his capacity for the kind of peaceful life that he had hoped to build with Marie Claire before her death, eliminated his motivation for continuing military service. Their successful evasion of the gang's pursuit created temporary safety, but also confirmed that their situation had escalated beyond simple criminal intimidation into organized warfare that would require either permanent flight from the territory or decisive action to eliminate threats that wouldn't be resolved through passive defense or hopeful waiting for law enforcement intervention. When they reached the safety of his cabin and realized that their enemy's capabilities were greater than expected, while their own resources were more limited than hoped. Both understood that their survival would depend on making choices that could change their lives permanently, while determining whether their developing love could survive the kind of tests that destroyed weaker relationships. The arrival of Federal Marshal Catherine Wells with a detachment of territorial rangers represented the first official response to reports about organized criminal activity that had been escalating throughout the region. As territorial authorities had finally recognized that local law enforcement lacked the resources and jurisdiction necessary for dealing with gangs whose operations crossed county boundaries and whose hideouts were located in federal territories where state officials had limited authority. Her investigation had been triggered by Sheriff Bradley's reports about the barn burning and suspected gang surveillance, but it had been accelerated by additional reports from other communities where similar criminal activity suggested coordinated operations that required federal intervention. Marshal Wells' interview with Etienne and Celeste revealed the extent of their situation while also providing context for understanding how individual acts of kindness could trigger criminal retaliation that affected entire communities whose safety depended on maintaining predictable relationships with elements that preferred to operate without official interference. Her questions about the gang's capabilities, resources, and apparent motivations were designed to develop intelligence that could be used for tracking and apprehending criminals whose success had been built on avoiding direct confrontation with organized law enforcement. The federal investigation that followed uncovered evidence of criminal operations that extended far beyond simple robbery and intimidation into territory involving territorial corruption, illegal land speculation, and systematic exploitation of isolated communities whose residents were too scattered and poorly organized to resist criminal pressure effectively. The scope of the conspiracy that Wells's investigation revealed made clear that the Garrison Gang was part of larger criminal network that had been operating throughout the mountain territories with cooperation from corrupt officials whose protection had made prosecution nearly impossible. Etienne's offer to serve as scout and guide for federal operations against the gang was motivated by recognition that passive defense couldn't provide long-term security for Celeste or other potential victims. While his unique knowledge of mountain terrain and tracking skills made him valuable to law enforcement officers whose urban experience hadn't prepared them for pursuing criminals through wilderness areas where conventional police tactics were ineffective, his willingness to risk his life in support of federal operations was complicated by awareness that active cooperation with authorities would make him an even greater target for retaliation if the operations failed to eliminate all threats. The plan that emerged from federal planning sessions involved using Etienne and Celeste as bait to draw the gang into ambush situations where superior federal firepower and tactical coordination could overcome criminal advantages in local knowledge and escape routes, But the risks involved in such operations required careful consideration of whether potential benefits justified exposing civilians to dangers that could easily result in casualties that federal authorities would be responsible for preventing. When Wells explained that their cooperation could be crucial for operations that might eliminate criminal threats throughout the territory, both understood that their personal safety was less important than community welfare, but that their survival might depend on federal capabilities that had yet to be tested against enemies who had proven remarkably effective at avoiding previous law enforcement efforts. The federal operation to eliminate the Garrison Gang began with systematic surveillance of known hideouts and escape routes, as Marshal Wells's Rangers used techniques that had been developed for tracking hostile Indian bands to locate criminals whose survival had depended on avoiding detection by less sophisticated law enforcement methods. Etienne's contribution as scout and guide proved invaluable for interpreting signs that would have been meaningless to officers whose experience had been gained in urban environments where criminal behavior followed different patterns and left different evidence. The cat-and-mouse game that developed as federal forces attempted to locate gang members while avoiding detection by lookouts who were watching for exactly such official interest required patience and tactical sophistication that tested everyone's ability to maintain operational security while gathering intelligence that could be used to plan decisive action. The gang's use of multiple camps and communication systems revealed organizational capabilities that exceeded typical outlaw operations, while their obvious preparation for siege warfare suggested that final confrontation would require overwhelming force rather than simple tactical superiority. Celeste's role in the operation evolved from simple bait into active participant as her demonstrated courage and practical intelligence made her valuable for tasks that required someone who could move through areas where federal agents would attract immediate attention from criminal lookouts. Her ability to gather information through casual conversations with area residents while appearing to conduct normal business created opportunities for intelligence gathering that would have been impossible for officials whose presence would have immediately alerted gang members to federal interest in their activities. The breakthrough that made final action possible came when Morrison's attempt to gather information about federal operations led him into ambush situation where his capture provided intelligence about gang resources, hideout locations, and planned responses to law enforcement pressure. His willingness to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges revealed details about criminal operations that allowed federal forces to plan coordinated attacks on multiple targets simultaneously, preventing gang members from escaping to alternate hideouts while also disrupting their communications and supply systems. The dawn assault on the gang's primary hideout was executed with military precision that reflected Marshal Wells's experience with territorial warfare. As coordinated attacks eliminated sentries while preventing escapes through routes that had been secured by Rangers, whose positioning had been guided by Etienne's intimate knowledge of mountain geography. The fierce resistance that followed demonstrated that gang members preferred death to capture, while their tactical competence proved that reports about their capabilities had been accurate rather than exaggerated, making the federal victory more significant for its difficulty than its inevitable outcome given superior resources and planning. The trial of surviving gang members provided the first comprehensive public accounting of criminal operations that had terrorized communities throughout the mountain territories, as federal prosecutors used evidence gathered during the investigation to demonstrate the scope of activities that had included not just robbery and murder, but systematic corruption of local officials and intimidation of honest citizens whose cooperation with law enforcement had been prevented through threats and actual violence against anyone who challenged criminal control of remote areas. Jake Garrison's conviction on multiple charges of murder, robbery, and conspiracy against federal authority was complicated by his insistence that his actions had been motivated by justified anger against Etienne's interference with legitimate business operations, revealing the twisted logic that criminals use to rationalize violence against people whose only crime had been showing kindness to someone in need. His execution was attended by representatives from communities that had suffered under gang depredations, while his final statements provided insights into criminal psychology that were studied by law enforcement officials throughout the territory. The broader investigation that had been triggered by the gang's activities revealed corruption networks that reached into territorial government and federal administration, leading to prosecutions that cleaned up official systems while establishing precedents for federal intervention in cases where local authorities were either unable or unwilling to protect citizens from organized criminal activity. The political reforms that resulted from these revelations strengthened territorial governance while providing legal frameworks for preventing similar criminal conspiracies in the future. Etienne's recognition as territorial hero for his role in the federal operations was accompanied by financial compensation that replaced the wealth he had sacrificed for Celeste's welfare, while his appointment as deputy federal marshal provided official position that acknowledged his unique qualifications for law enforcement work in mountain territories where conventional police methods were ineffective. His willingness to continue dangerous work despite having achieved personal security demonstrated commitment to community welfare that exceeded simple professional obligation. The transformation of Cedar Ridge from community, divided by gossip and fear, into model of frontier cooperation was symbolized by the public celebration that honored both Etienne's heroism and Celeste's courage, while acknowledging that their love story had catalyzed changes that benefited everyone in the region. When Reverend Patterson publicly apologized for his previous criticism and praised their relationship as example of how divine providence could work through human love to achieve good that exceeded individual happiness, the community's acceptance of their partnership was complete and official. The wedding of Etienne and Celeste was celebrated throughout Cedar Ridge as symbol of triumph over adversity, and proof that love could overcome any obstacle when people possessed sufficient courage to choose happiness despite social conventions that would have kept them apart. The ceremony took place in the new church that had been built with donations from grateful citizens whose prosperity had been secured through the federal operations that had eliminated criminal threats, while the reception demonstrated community support that transcended previous divisions about appropriate behavior and social boundaries. Their honeymoon journey to San Francisco provided opportunities to experience civilized society and cultural refinements that frontier life rarely offered, but also confirmed their preference for mountain living that provided independence and natural beauty that urban environments couldn't match, despite their conveniences and sophistications. The contrast between city life and territorial existence helped them appreciate what they had built together while also providing perspective on choices they had made during the crisis that had tested their relationship. The ranch they established on land that combined Etienne's original holdings with property purchased through his federal compensation created an operation that was both profitable and efficient, while their partnership in managing complex agricultural and livestock operations demonstrated compatibility that extended beyond romantic attraction into practical cooperation that made their combined efforts more successful than either could have achieved alone. Their prosperity was built on mutual respect and shared labor rather than traditional gender roles that would have limited Celeste's contributions to domestic tasks. The adoption of orphaned children whose parents had been killed during gang operations provided opportunities for creating the family that both had dreamed of during their previous losses, while also offering practical assistance with ranch work that required more labor than two people could provide effectively. The children's integration into their household created bonds that transcended simple employer-employee relationships into genuine family connections that enriched everyone's life while providing security for young people whose futures would have been uncertain without such intervention. Their reputation throughout the territory as couple whose love had triumphed over extraordinary challenges attracted visitors who sought advice about relationships, business ventures, and community development that could benefit from their experience with overcoming obstacles through cooperation and mutual support. Their influence on territorial development extended far beyond their individual success into areas involving social progress and community building that established models for other frontier settlements seeking to create stable societies based on justice and mutual respect, rather than violence and exploitation. The school that Etienne and Celeste established on their ranch became the first educational institution in the mountain territories that provided advanced instruction in both practical frontier skills and academic subjects that prepared students for leadership roles in territorial development and governance. Their recognition that frontier communities needed educated leaders who understood both traditional learning and practical challenges created educational philosophy that influenced territorial policy while providing opportunities for young people whose potential might otherwise have been wasted through lack of appropriate instruction. Celeste's work as unofficial doctor and medical advisor for surrounding communities evolved into formal training programs that prepared frontier women to provide healthcare services in areas where professional medical assistance was unavailable or inadequate for addressing common health problems that could be treated effectively through proper knowledge and preparation. Her influence on territorial healthcare policy helped establish standards and procedures that reduced mortality rates while improving quality of life for isolated residents. The agricultural innovations that Etienne developed through experimentation with crops and livestock breeding techniques created methods that increased productivity while reducing labor requirements, making frontier farming more profitable and sustainable for families whose survival depended on maximizing returns from limited resources and challenging environmental conditions. His contributions to territorial agriculture were documented and distributed through federal programs that helped other communities achieve similar improvements. The law enforcement techniques that had been developed during federal operations against the Garrison Gang became standard procedures for territorial rangers and federal marshals, whose responsibilities included protecting remote communities from criminal activities that conventional police methods couldn't address effectively. Etienne's continued service as deputy federal marshal provided expertise that was crucial for training new officers while maintaining security in areas where criminal threats remained significant, despite successful prosecution of major gang operations. Their joint memoir about their experiences during the crisis that had brought them together became required reading at territorial academies, where future leaders studied examples of how individual courage and community cooperation could overcome challenges that seemed impossible when approached through conventional methods. Their story inspired legislation that protected citizens who chose to assist law enforcement operations, while also establishing precedents for federal intervention in cases where local authorities needed assistance with problems that exceeded their capabilities or jurisdiction. The barn raising that replaced the structure destroyed by the Garrison Gang was attended by representatives from communities throughout the mountain territories, as the symbolic significance of rebuilding what criminals had destroyed resonated with people whose own experiences with violence and loss had taught them to value acts of reconstruction and renewal that demonstrated triumph over forces that sought to destroy rather than create. The new barn was larger and better designed than its predecessor, incorporating improvements that reflected lessons learned through adversity. 20 years after the fire that had nearly destroyed his dreams, Etienne's ranch had become the center of a network of prosperous farms and businesses whose success was built on cooperation and mutual assistance, rather than competition and exploitation that had characterized earlier periods of territorial development. The community that had grown around their example provided evidence that frontier society could achieve stability and prosperity through methods that emphasized justice and community welfare rather than individual accumulation of wealth and power. The children they had raised were assuming leadership roles throughout the territory, carrying forward values and principles that had been demonstrated through their parents' example, while adapting to changing conditions that required new approaches to familiar problems. Their success in preparing the next generation for responsible citizenship demonstrated that education and moral instruction could produce leaders whose commitment to community welfare exceeded personal ambition or narrow self-interest. Celeste's transformation from desperate widow to territorial leader whose influence extended throughout the mountain regions provided inspiration for other women whose circumstances had been limited by social conventions that restricted their opportunities for meaningful contribution to community development. Her example encouraged legislative changes that expanded women's rights while creating precedents for female participation in territorial governance and business operations that had previously been reserved for men. The visitors who came to learn from their example included federal officials whose responsibilities required them to understand how successful frontier communities could be developed and maintained, while their advice influenced territorial policy that was being implemented throughout the western regions, where similar challenges required solutions that had been tested through practical experience rather than theoretical speculation. Their ranch had become a laboratory for democracy and community development that provided models for national expansion. The evening sun painted the new barn in shades of gold and amber as Etienne and Celeste sat on their porch, surrounded by grandchildren whose laughter echoed across the valley that had been the scene of so much drama during their younger years. The peace that had settled over their land was the kind that came not from absence of conflict, but from conflicts resolved through courage and love that had proven stronger than hatred and greed. The mountains that had witnessed their greatest trials now stood as silent guardians of happiness that had been earned through sacrifice and tested through adversity. The letter that had arrived that morning from the territorial governor contained news that their youngest adopted son had been appointed as the first federal judge for the mountain territories, completing a circle of justice that had begun with their own struggles against criminal violence and official corruption. His success in achieving high office through merit rather than political connections demonstrated that the values they had taught were being carried forward by people whose commitment to justice had been shaped by examples of how individual courage could change entire communities. The memorial they had established for Henri Moreau and Marie-Claire Fontaine stood in the town cemetery, where Celeste's tears had first moved Etienne to the act of generosity that had changed both their lives forever. The simple monument acknowledged debts to the past while celebrating possibilities for futures that had been made possible through love that transcended death, transforming loss into motivation for building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Their wealth, rebuilt through honest work and careful investment, was being used to establish institutions that would serve the community long after their own deaths. Ensuring that their legacy would continue benefiting people they would never meet, while demonstrating that true prosperity was measured not by personal accumulation, but by contributions to community welfare that outlasted individual lifetimes. The foundation they had created for education and healthcare would provide services for generations while perpetuating values that had transformed a violent frontier into a peaceful and prosperous region. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky and their grandchildren settled down for bedtime stories about the early days when outlaws roamed the mountains and heroes were made through simple acts of kindness, Etienne and Celeste reflected on the miraculous chain of events that had begun with tears beside a grave and led to love that had changed not just their own lives, but the entire character of the territory they called home. The gold he had traded for her tears had been transformed into something far more valuable than precious metal. It had become the foundation for happiness that would endure long after earthly treasures had turned to dust, proving that the greatest wealth was love shared and justice served in communities where people chose courage over comfort and compassion over greed. Their story had become legend, but their love remained real and daily, a testament to the truth that, when a cowboy trades his gold for a widow's tears, he might just discover that the greatest treasures are those that cannot be stolen, burned, or destroyed by anyone whose understanding of value is limited to what can be counted, rather than what can be felt in the depths of a grateful heart.